Hello readers, I'm David Ruder, and today I'm gonna do a video where I evaluate the main geopolitical predictions that Peter Zeihan did in his 4 books. My opinions on his books have changed over time, so the ratings that I gave to book 1 and 3 have actually gone down over time, so we're gonna talk about that also in this video. And I'm gonna go book by book on his predictions, but where he repeats himself, I'm gonna skip that. With that said, let's get into the first book, The Accidental Superpower. So of all Peter Zeihan's books, this one is the closest to the truth, I would say, but still he makes a lot of bogus geopolitical predictions. First prediction: the US naval trade security guarantee will be withdrawn from the world. No, and I'm gonna tell you why. Peter Zeihan believes that the United States is not dependent on world trade. That's not true. It's less dependent than the rest of the world, but it's still dependent quite a lot on semiconductors, for example, in Taiwan, or getting some minerals from China or elsewhere. So it is in the American interest to maintaining the current world order, where the US Navy ensures that no one screws around too much. Next prediction: global demographics are gonna doom most of the world. No, for a myriad of factors. So sure, demographics are probably going to doom Russia. But that's not just because of Russia's demographics. It's because of their screwed up government. It's because of them having an economic environment where no immigrants want to go to. It's because of a lot of factors that don't mitigate Russia's bad demographics. So most of Europe has poor demographics. However, they're wealthy, so they have money to import stuff. They're also highly technologically developed, so less and less they're gonna need a big labor force. And countries always have the option to import immigrants, and yes, most immigrants want to go to the United States, but Europe is still a decent choice, and it doesn't always work that well, but Europe could possibly solve parts of its problems through immigration. And this is what we have with Turkish workers in Germany, or with Eastern Europeans working in Western Europe. And then you have countries where they have a good culture which would counteract their bad demographics. So for example, China, sure, their demographics are screwed up, but they have a really hard-working population, which makes it more likely that China is going to be alright. Next prediction, and this one, the first part already came true. So Russia would invade Ukraine. Yes, that has happened. And then it will collapse. So this is a bold claim, but I'm gonna say it's quite highly likely in the coming decades. We see how precarious Putin's power is with the fact that Prigozhin led a Wagner mutiny, and yes, that ended alright for Putin, kind of. But that shows that the Russian state is not that stable, and Russian demographic proportions are shifting from a large ethnic majority Russian population to a larger and larger minority Muslim population. And Zeihan claims that once Putin is gone, Razman Kadyrov, who rules Chechnya, will succeed. And even if this wasn't so, Muslim regions are really known to hate people who dominate them, so they are likely to attempt to secede anyways. And the North Caucasus region in Russia is well known to have a lot of Islamists. Zeihan is probably on point relating to the collapse of Russia question. But this is not just because of demographics, this is also because Russia has a lack of legitimacy. It's a kleptocracy. Next prediction: Turkey will expand. So I'm gonna qualify this. So yes, Turkey is expanding its sphere of influence, but not its territory necessarily. So Turkey will continue to spread its influence in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and countries like that, in parts of North Africa, such as we've seen in Libya, I believe. However, Zeihan claims also that they're gonna expand into Crimea, and Romania, and Bulgaria, and the Balkans, and former Yugoslavia, which no. There are some countries that are sympathetic to Turkey in the Balkans, such as Albania and Bosnia, since they're Muslims, but Orthodox Christendom in Europe, such as Serbia, dislike Turkey, so they're never gonna allow Turkey to expand their influence there. And Greece, of course, dislikes Turkey, so they're never gonna allow Turkey to expand their influence there. And also, NATO exists. Turkey may leave NATO one day, who knows? But the security guarantee covers a large part of the Balkans, so Turkey is not expanding there. Next prediction: the EU will collapse, and it's likely that Germany and Poland goes to war. No, that's not gonna happen. Peter Zeihan thinks that the EU is doomed, which I would disagree with, because the EU central banking system is directed by Germany. Thank God that it's Germany and not France. Germany still, to a large part, believe in austerity, and for Central European countries and Italy to continue to receive development money, they have to follow German economic policy to a certain extent. And the EU has a lot of attractive qualities. With the invasion of Ukraine, we actually saw several new countries applying to join the EU, such as Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. So I believe that the European Union, instead of dissolving, may even expand. Sure, they lost the UK, but the UK has always been kind of aloof from the rest of Europe. But all developing countries in Europe wanna join the EU. Even Serbia, which is kind of Russian friendly, wants to join the EU. Next prediction, China will disintegrate. Now, if you watch my review of the Accidental Superpower, you may remember that I was actually quite positive on this last year. However, the more I reflect on this and the more geopolitics book I read about China, I read the Geopolitics book, for example, by a former Australian Prime Minister, which talks about the coming Sino-American conflict. He didn't give any indication that China will collapse. And this is a guy that has met with Xi Jinping. China has a lot of factors going for it. Although they have screwed up demographics because of the one-child policy, they still have a strong Confucian culture with strong work ethics, and they are quickly developing, so a mix of culture and technology may replace the aging population that are working less. Zeihan has talked about the minorities in Western China, but the thing is, China is performing ethnic Han Chinese colonization there, so Muslim Xinjiang and Buddhist Tibet are going to become majority Chinese over time. And the Chinese Communist Party leadership, although they've issued a lot of bad debt, as Zeihan talks about, they still have semi-sensible leaders that understand the importance to collaborate with the United States. They're also diversifying their economy. So the Belt and Road Initiative actually included a lot of investment within China. And you have some countries that are kind of closing up to China. And you can see that China is not a waning power with the fact that they're seizing some islands in the South China Sea. So I don't believe that China will collapse at all. I believe that their power will continue to rise, although it will slow down and it will never equal the American power until they democratize. So those are Peter Zeihan's main predictions in the Accidental Superpower. Now I'm gonna give my re-evaluation rating. Last year I gave it an 8 out of 10. This time I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. A lot of stuff he said in his book is correct, but he also makes up a bunch of stuff that's not true. Still his best book and the one that's worth reading the most if you were gonna read a Peter Zeihan book. Now let's move on to the Absent Superpower. So Peter Zeihan claims that a lot of countries will go to war because of the US withdrawal. So I already mentioned that I don't believe that the US Navy will withdraw from the world, but there's another reason why a lot of countries will not go to war with each other. Because there are trade interests, and it's in the interest of almost everyone to be at peace. We can see that when you have wars between countries now, usually they're quite short. Most wars are intra-wars, but when you had an interstate war such as Azerbaijan against Armenia, that lasted only for a couple months. Sure, you have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that's the exception to the rule. Sure, you may have a bunch of civil wars, but you're not gonna have a bunch of great powers who are going to go to war with each other, as Peter Zeihan believes. Next prediction, NATO is void and Russia will attack a large part of Europe. No, so true, Russia attacked Ukraine, but however, Peter Zeihan believed that Russia would destroy Ukraine quickly. That did not happen. Ukraine is still standing and they're trying to reclaim some of the territory they've lost in the east, but they're making a valiant fight and Russia is not gonna be able to conquer Ukraine. NATO is not void. NATO has actually strengthened since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What happened to NATO after the invasion of Ukraine was the opposite of what Putin wanted actually. So now Finland has joined NATO and Sweden is pretty much in NATO too also now. So NATO has actually expanded instead of being void. And Russia will not attack NATO countries. Sure, they could conquer the Baltics if the Baltics was not covered by the American nuclear umbrella. But the worst thing Russia can do is attack non-NATO members. So they can no longer attack Finland because they're in NATO now. They could attack Moldova, sure. They could attack Georgia maybe. But that's the worst they can do. They can't attack the Baltics or Romania or Poland because of the NATO guarantee. Next prediction, you're gonna have a large energy crisis that's gonna cause a lot of problems around the world. Now we kind of had this, but not to such an extent as Peter Zeihan predicted. So we've had rising energy prices, which happened because of COVID and the Russian-Ukraine war, but countries are learning to diversify and adapt. And you also have energy substitutes like petroleum from Venezuela or from the Middle East. And you can also have green energy such as wind and solar, or you can have nuclear energy. And Peter Zeihan doesn't really believe that green energy and nuclear energy is feasible. I disagree with that. I'll talk about that later. Next, he predicts there's gonna be war in the Middle East. And if you remember my review of the Absent Superpower last year, then you remember that I was kind of positive on this. But now that I think back of it, it's unlikely, I think, because the United States has an interest in keeping oil markets kind of stable, because their allies are in Europe and their European allies actually need the oil from the Middle East, and their allies in East Asia also need the oil from the Middle East. So it's in almost everyone's interest to keep the Middle East stable. So while the USA is decreasing their military force there, I still believe they're gonna keep some of it there. An alternative to the Saudi-Iranian war that Peter Zeihan believes is that you could have more insurgencies within countries. So you could have the Shias rebelling, for example, in Saudi Arabia, maybe backed by Iran, or the Sunnis in Iran rebelling backed by the Saudis, but their militaries are designed specifically to keep their insurgencies at bay. So even that's not that likely. You could have more conflict in unstable countries like Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Libya, but you're not gonna have a full-out war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because that's not in the interest of any of the great powers. Next, with this instability in the Middle East and Russia, Zeihan predicts there will be a tanker war in East Asia between Japan and China and other countries. Now I'm gonna disagree with this, because US supply chains are in large part concentrated in this region. So the USA is of course gonna keep their naval presence there, so there won't be any war. You could have a short conflict over Taiwan, that's possible. But that's the most thing you can have. And there could always be a brief war between Vietnam and China, who knows. But it's highly unlikely for it to be a large-scale tanker war between the major powers in Northeast Asia, because it's not even in the interest of Northeast Asian powers like Japan or China to do so, as they're all to a certain extent trade dependent and dependent on each other. So if China goes to war with someone, sanctions could create a recession in China, which creates a lot of problems. So China has an interest of not screwing around too much. Next prediction, Argentina will develop because they have shale and good demographics. Probably not. And that's because Argentina has been screwed up since the Great Depression and Peronism and things like that. Could Argentina develop if they had sensible government institutions? Yes, but that has never really happened. They have had fleeting economic growth and from time to time a bit of semi-sensible leadership, but it's never lasting, so I don't see that changing. If you don't have dependable institutions and politics, you're not gonna have foreign direct investment. And Argentina needs this if they want to develop. Chile is stable, so they get that. Argentina isn't, so they don't get that. So Argentina is not poor by any means, but they will not become some big power in South America, as Peter Zeihan thinks. Next prediction, US continued influence in Southeast Asia and Latin America. Of course, because Latin America, Monroe Doctrine, and then Southeast Asia, key strategic place for the United States. And the general prediction of this book by Peter Zeihan is that the shale revolution can make the US ignore the world. Now sure, it's true that the United States is oil independent now, but they're still interdependent on other world prices of energy. So we saw with COVID that gas prices rose heavily by a third or more sometimes. So it's in the US people's interest at least to keep the world stable so that things don't get too expensive. And it's harder to be re-elected if the living standards of your people are decreasing because of price instabilities. So the USA will always have an interest to keep supply chains and energy chains stable. Now time for the re-evaluation of the Absent Superpower. Last year I gave it an 8. This time I'm decreasing my rating badly to a 5 out of 10, because this book is a lot more about erroneous predictions than the previous Peter Zeihan book, Accidental Superpower, and he predicts a bunch of wars that are highly unlikely, and he exaggerates the importance of the shale revolution. Moving on to the next book is Disunited Nations, and this is Peter Zeihan's worst book in my opinion. It's just superfluous because it repeats a lot of stuff that he already said in Accidental Superpower and Absent Superpower, just in more words, so it's less concise than his two previous books, but there's not that much new content. But I'm gonna go over some of the new content. So first thing that Peter Zeihan claims, only the USA has the ability to have an effective supercarrier fleet and navy. No, China is a wealthy country with a fast-growing GDP, so you're gonna see them becoming a more and more important naval power. It's probably not gonna be comparable to the United States, but still. Next prediction, the US dollar will remain the main reserve currency and will not be replaced by the Chinese yuan. Yes, that is true. But I'm gonna add a caveat to this, that it's going to be true, but to a lesser extent more and more. Because people are looking for more and more alternatives to the US dollar. Of course, those alternatives, such as a BRICS currency, are never as trustworthy as a US dollar. So the US dollar will remain the main currency, just to a lesser extent. Next prediction, green energy potential is limited to a handful of countries, excluding places like Germany, for example. Now this is blatantly false, because if you just look at Germany, for example, almost half of their electricity sources come from green energy. So green energy has a lot of potential. It's exaggerated by climate activists, but still it has a lot of potential, as does nuclear. You have nuclear power plants being built around the world now. Maybe not that much in the West, but quite a lot in Asia. Next prediction, Brazil will decline because they lack the important fertilizers they use to grow food. Could Brazil decline? Yes, but that's because of screwed up economic policies by the government, not because they cannot import fertilizers. And also Brazil has a lot of drug problems, so that's another thing that holds them back. So Peter Zeihan is right in the sense that Brazil could decline, but for the wrong reasons, and it's more likely that Brazil will just stagnate. Next prediction, the United States wants global instability. No, quite the contrary. The USA prays for world peace. They really want it. Sometimes they create conflicts inadvertently, but no, they don't like the world being screwed up and at war with each other. Remember, the United States wants the Ukraine war to end and for Russia to stop screwing around. And the United States is careful with how it interacts with Taiwan to avoid war with China. So no, the United States does not want global instability because it's bad for business and for trade and for supply chains, as we've seen with rising energy and food costs because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what is my reevaluation of Disunited Nations? I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 10. This book is a waste of your time, basically, in my opinion. It repeats a bunch of stuff from the previous books, it makes a bunch of bogus predictions, and it has barely any redeemable qualities. And now let's move on to Peter Zeihan's fourth and final book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. So one of the first predictions Peter Zeihan made in this book is that it was highly likely for Xi Jinping to lose power at the next communist meeting in 2022. But as we know, that didn't happen. Xi Jinping has been chosen for another term to be the leader of China's Communist Party. And it's likely that Xi Jinping will stay in power in China until the 2030s at least. Next prediction, deglobalization will occur. Now I'm gonna say yes, partially to a certain extent, because you have some increases in tariff barriers and countries want more home production, but not because of global instability that much. We may want to become less reliable on Russia and China, but we're not gonna stop importing stuff from South America, for example. We have no problems with them. We're gonna keep getting our bananas from there, for example. So deglobalization will occur a bit, but not that much. And in other aspects, you're gonna continue to have globalization because it's in pretty much everyone's economic interest to do so, as the positive sum game and comparative advantage of trade says. Next prediction, pirates will make a comeback and start seizing shipments. Not really. You will have Iran maybe who seizes some shipments from time to time, but apart from that, you won't really have any pirates. The Somali pirate industry was destroyed by America's Blackwater. You may have a little bit of piracy from time to time, but it won't be that bad. And you will not have any large-scale piracy return, as Peter Zeihan claims, or have India start becoming a state piracy firm, because the USA will just not allow it. Next prediction, depopulation. Now, over time, yes, that is kind of true, but this will occur not because of mass deaths, and more because you're gonna have less and less kids. People have less and less kids because of development and because of things like the pill. So you will have a declining, aging population, but not a large-scale depopulation like Peter Zeihan predicts. Next prediction, capital flight. Yes, kind of, but not widespread like Peter Zeihan believes because, oh, aging, so there's less capital available. No, you're gonna have a range of this. In countries that attract less foreign direct investment, like Venezuela or some other countries that have bogus economic policies, then yes, you will have capital flight. You won't have capital flight in a place like Singapore. People will invest where the regime is dependable. In countries where the regime is not dependable, sure, you'll have capital flight. But this is not really a universal phenomenon. It's on a case-by-case basis. Next predictions, countries will switch to coal. Mostly no. So sure, Germany is building up their coal plants, but they're also diversifying into green energy. Sure, China is building up coal plants, but that's just temporary because one of the priorities of the Chinese government is to think about the climate because that's the main thing that causes protests in China. And you have a bunch of countries that are building nuclear reactors. So no, we will not have a return to coal that much. Over time, the proportion of energy that's coal-based will decline because there's a global consensus that we need to do something about climate change. Next prediction, decivilization, no. You haven't had a decivilization in a very, very long time. Next prediction, it's going to be hard to import materials that are necessary for your economy. Now, yes, this is going to be more and more true, but to a limited extent, and it will fluctuate because of different dynamics of the world, such as war in Ukraine or other factors, such as China asserting itself more and more. But still, it's in everyone's interest, people who export, people who import, to keep markets open and to keep trade open. So Zeihan is partially right related to this, but also to a large extent he is wrong. Next prediction: countries who haven't had the opportunity to industrialize yet will never industrialize and development will stop. No, this is not true. Because if you look at which are the places that have the highest GDP growth rates right now, a lot of those countries are among the poorest countries in Africa. Places like Rwanda or places that have been war-torn in Central Africa, they're actually improving quite decently over time. So no, the undeveloped world will continue to develop. There may be some exceptions to this because of bad government, but you still have overall the same trend. World GDP has recovered since COVID, for example. Zeihan's final prediction I'm gonna talk about: famine will kill 1 billion people soon. No. Could you have bad famines in the future? Sure, you could have famines because of war or really bad government, but you're not gonna have a large-scale famine which kills 1 billion people, because you have things like the UN and countries coordinating together to make sure that famines don't occur. And also we have a lot of food substitutes that we can pick from. So you're not gonna have a large-scale famine. You may have local or some regional famines, but they won't be large-scale. Overall, I stand by my evaluation of the end of the world is just the beginning, a 4 out of 10, because Zeihan includes a lot of interesting information, but he also repeats himself a bit, and he makes a bunch of predictions that are just erroneous. And also a problem with Peter Zeihan's books in general is that he doesn't provide any sources for how he came to his conclusion. So you have no idea whether he's just making this up or whether he just knows a bunch of information we don't know about. There you have it. First book, 6 out of 10. Second book, 5 out of 10. Third book, 3 out of 10. Fourth book, 4 out of 10. My final conclusion about Peter Zeihan: Peter Zeihan is a fatalistic doomer who repeats himself a lot, and he makes a bunch of dumb factual errors that people who know stuff pick up. And he also underestimates the dynamism of culture and societies and of the world in general. There have been people who have said the world is gonna decline, the world is screwed. People have been saying that for a long time. For over 100 years, people have talked about the decline of the West. That hasn't happened economically yet. We're richer than ever, the world is relatively free compared to what it was 50 years ago, and I think that things may decline temporarily in some places, but overall you're gonna have the continuing trend of things improving. So what do I think of Peter Zeihan as a geopolitical commentator? He makes interesting predictions, but generally they're wrong, and they're based on flawed analysis, inspired by misunderstandings of geography, overemphasis on demographics and energy. You probably should read the Accidental Superpower because he makes a lot of interesting points, but all of his other books, it's a waste of time for you to read them pretty much. There are other much more worthwhile authors to read, such as Tim Marshall or Robert Kaplan, who are more grounded in reality. So that was my evaluation of geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan and his 4 geopolitical books. And if you want to learn about a more sensible geopolitical analyst, then you should check out my playlist on Robert Kaplan books. Anyways, I'm the average reader, and I will see readers next time.